I'm your host Teresa, and if you're glum and bummed, this is not the episode for you. Today's video, we are counting down the top 10 worst times to be alive in history. Be ready to use perspective, because worst is always a super debatable term, and while some of these time periods weren't the worst for everyone to be alive in, they were if it affected your ethnicity, gender, religion, or region sometimes. So let's get started. Number 10 is the 30-Year War. This war occurred in the 17th century and is considered one of the most lethal events in colonial history. This is because if you consider the proportion of casualties to the total population of Europe at the time, it was actually even deadlier than the Black Plague or World War II. The focal point of this war was religion, as Catholics and Protestants were beefing it up all over Europe and devastating the countryside. Almost all the big powers of Europe were involved, making this conflict quite widespread. Naturally, having a bunch of countries focused on sieging one another resulted in neglect towards civilians. Poverty, disease, and famine were huge during this time, let alone what little they have being constantly pillaged and looted by mercenary units. So, while the 30-Year War doesn't get as much credit as more popular recent catastrophes in Europe, anyone who was alive and well in the time would have definitely seen some things. Number 9 is the Year of Revolution. The Year of Revolution was 1848, where the spring and summer saw uprise of people of Europe demanding change in numerous countries. This was most notable in France, the states that would become Germany, Denmark, and Austria and Hungary. But in total, record shows more than 50 nations affected by unrest in that year. This led to hundreds of thousands of people's demise, whether at the hands of their own authorities, each other, disease, or riots. However, whether it was all worth the sacrifice remains the source of much historical debate. 1848 also represents the height of the Irish famine, which left hundreds of thousands dead and caused many millions to leave their homeland for good. And while the French monarchy did fall once again, in many places the old orders clung on to power by making just a few token concessions, and Europe's middle class earned a greater rep. But the heightened and touchy senses of nationalism would simmer below the surfaces for decades to come until the largest consequence of the Year of Revolution reared its ugly head: World War I. The powerful German Confederacy found its foundation in the 1848 revolutions. Number 8 is the Siege of Sarajevo. From 1992 to 1996, this is the longest siege to ever happen on a capital city in modern history. Sieges themselves are incredibly bad times to be in, and many have humanitarian disasters such as the Siege of Leningrad. This Siege of Sarajevo is a horrific example with close to 14,000 deaths recorded, but more are incredibly likely. Before fighting broke out in Bosnia and Herzegovina in April of 1992, Bosnian Serbs constructed and reinforced positions in the hills overlooking Sarajevo, believing that crushing resistance there would do the same everywhere. So, when conflict ensured, they imposed a total blockade, denying Sarajevo food, power, transport, and water. Serbian forces did have better munitions, but lacked the forces necessary to storm, and the Herzegovina had the superior numbers, but lacked the munitions to storm. So it becomes a stalemate, one that lasts 4 years. Shellings destroyed markets and communities alike, and families moved into homes that still had solid structuring with other families. The tight quarters made it easier for everyone to keep warm, an added benefit as there was no fuel or supplies in many cities. With no way to leave, a once prominent city became essentially a refugee camp for its own people. Number 7 is 1958 to 1962 China. It starts with the Great Leap Forward, a campaign introduced by Communist Chairman Mao in 1958. The purpose was to modernize China's agriculture and steel production. This campaign came with a mandatory agriculture collectivization. Its policies prohibited private farming. When people are forced to stop producing for themselves, the Chinese government begins to notice perhaps their yields may not be enough. Fearful, though, of failing their superiors, instead of rectifying the issue, officials in charge exaggerated the farm yields on paper to the point that there was a food shortage. People were confused. How could so much food be documented yet none on their shelves? And it hadn't been allocated and dispersed as needed because it wasn't known. Not very communistic of the communists. This triggered the Great Chinese Famine. The death toll isn't accurately known, but is believed to be somewhere between 15 and 55 million. On top of famine deaths, civilians who had become suspicious as to what was happening and voiced up against the government resulted in 2.5 executed for suspected anti-government activity. Between famine and a government execution, it's recorded approximately 3 million people simply just made the decision to take their own lives. Number 6 is the Justinian Plague. It's considered the most devastating plague in human history, yet it's largely been forgotten. What came to be called the Justinian Plague after the Roman Empire of the time spread rapidly through most of Eastern Rome and even the Ottomans. It's said that only 60% of the recorded global population at the time were killed. We do not know how many civilizations had yet to be recorded then, so this could also be incredibly inaccurate. Anyways, in 542, the plague hit its pinnacle critical. As many as 5,000 people were dying per day, and a massive spike in grain and non-perishable food prices caused famine. Even Justinian himself had gotten sick, but he pulled through it and lived another decade, seeing himself how the plague lingered, which it did for another 200 years. This plague is believed to have killed 25 to 50 million people between 541 and 542, let alone the numbers killed by famine and food riots. It's also contributed to the hastened collapse of the Roman Empire. Number 5 is another plague, the Black Death. Everyone knows this one for jokes about how a single rat and a whole bunch of unsanitary people led to a mass population wipe. And it's true, it's one of the most cataclysmic plagues in human history, with anywhere between 75 to 200 million deaths. This is believed to be about 30 to 60% of Europe's recorded population, all between 1346 and 1356. Europe at the time wasn't like other countries. They hadn't advanced with medicine the way that they had, so they were even more susceptible. Not knowing the causes, prevention was pretty much impossible. People were contracting the plague easily through flea and bedbug bites. Most perished within days, a blessed relief to their misery as sores and lesions infested their bodies and rotted the skin as they vomited of blood and later their own, well, I'll just let you look it up. Entire towns were wiped out in this horrific manner, and over the next decade it ravaged large parts of Europe and then Asia as well. In the Middle East they had more medical awareness and they managed to slow the spread, but only after a third of their population perished, while in Egypt 40% of the people had died. Of course, the survivors were desperate to figure out the cause of the disease and vented their fury on anyone they could find. So both civilian mobs and church authorities upped the death counts by killing thousands of Jews, Romani, and other minorities. Number 4 is a year of no summer. It's like the opposite of 500 Days of Summer, but not a movie, and literally terrifying. Part 1. In 1815, Mount Tambora, up in present-day Indonesia, erupted in what was the most powerful volcanic eruption ever recorded. The eruption itself killed an estimated 12,000 people. Part 2. The following year, the ash cloud thrown into the sky by Tambora finally settled and devastated the global climate, leading to crop failures and famine in certain sectors of the earth. It was essentially a snow age caused by the ash and the dust thrown into the atmosphere, which reflected sunlight and caused global temperatures to plummet. In Europe, the winter of 1816 was so bad that snow fell in August and people were reported to freeze and crops withered, leading to widespread starvation. In China and India, droughts, floods, and diseases killed potentially millions of people. In Europe, crops withered across the continent, leading to widespread starvation. Meanwhile, in the US, a dry fog descended across large parts of the country. New England was hit particularly hard. Temperatures plummeted and farmers reported their crops dying in the field. An estimated 200,000 people lost their lives due to these conditions in 1816. Number 3 is American colonialization. In 1492, Christopher Columbus arrived in America, and not only did it mark colonization of America, but it saw practically all indigenous cultures that were once rich and complex repressed and wiped out, reimagined in history to be simple or savage. The times of American colonization decimated indigenous population. Between smallpox and the action of colonizers, we see between a 60 and 90% of our population slaughtered. Once having populations over 100 million, we were rendered down to a mere few thousand. This was a genocide that is long perpetuated by the acts of endless massacre. Enslavements, residential schools, the 60 Scoop, the Trail of Tears, and so many other government initiatives to erase a whole culture. As a proportion of the global population, this was the single biggest reduction of a human population in history to date, as it made up to close of 10% of all people living on the world at the time. In comparison, the second most devastating event is World War II, and it only reduced the population by 3%. The decimation of indigenous populations of North America was so huge it changed global weather patterns and caused a dip in temperatures around the world by the beginning of the 17th century. But don't forget, Columbus and the colonial movement started Africans at this time as well and bringing them over. Stolen people are brought to stolen lands, and millions of Africans die during their transportation or due to uprisings and exposure to foreign illnesses the way the indigenous had. Number 2 is ironically number 1, the year 536 dark cloud. What I mean by this is scientists have actually determined the worst time to be alive. No estimates, no guesses. It's for a fact the year 536. I mentioned this in our True Stories from the Dark Ages video, so it may be familiar to you. During 536, a mysterious fog rested over Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, causing a day and night darkness that lasted 18 months. Temperatures that summer fell between 34.7 Fahrenheit to 36.5 Fahrenheit, initiating the coldest decade in the past 2,300 years. Snow fell that summer in China, and the Irish Chronicles record a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. Crops failed universally. Meat was rare without sun for plants. Many animals starved, as did people. They also perished from cold, cannibalism, and a few other nasty conditions. This discovery was actually made from tree ring studies in the 1990s, suggesting summers around the year 536 to 540 were unusually cold. Researchers hunted for a cause, and the Change Institute of University of Maine figured it out. Their team recovered that a cataclysmic volcano eruption in Iceland spewed ash across the northern hemisphere in early 536. Two other massive eruptions followed in 540 and 547. Between the initial eruptions and the ones that followed, instead of just a year of no summer, they got many months of winter and darkness. So, how is the proven worst time to be alive coming in second? Because the Toba Catastrophe is number one. It happened somewhere between 70 to 75,000 years ago, and we know very little about it aside from the fact it was a supervolcanic eruption whose ash cloud didn't just cover a few countries, it covered the world. This wasn't just darkness and cold, this was smog and smoke and ash covering the ground alongside the snow. The explosion and pollution, famine, and disease it caused reduced the global population of humans by 60 to 90%. That's right, up to 90%. Scientists have estimated that the event meant that only as few as 3,000 to 10,000 humans were left. And when you consider that animal populations have to drop to 2,500 for us to consider them endangered, there was a time when our species got very close. For reference, over 10,000 people die per day now. Scientists figured out this happened by looking at the Toba ash deposits found worldwide and the genetic diversity of the people living today. They already knew that there was a bottleneck somewhere in history, so they compared this genealogy to our current genetic diversity and they found significant differences. They found the bottleneck and the proof we nearly had gone extinct. It's pretty insane that our current population of 7 billion people are all descendants of only 3 to 10,000 people. Imagine the genetic diversity had all those people survive. It was great seeing you guys again, and I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to like and subscribe to see more Bumblebee content. Remember, everything changes and nothing stays the same. Take advantage of your life while you're living it.